if I only had one word to describe Reds, that word would probably be red, or possibly Reds. Another word that comes to mind is masterpiece. Thankfully, I'm allowed more than one word on this channel. Your loss, my gain. So I'll tell you why I think this is a contender for one of the great American movies. But I'll also tell you about some stumbling blocks that I think keep people from liking this movie, some people, and a few things that actually irritated me about it as well. Before we get going, I want to just acknowledge that the last movie I reviewed on the channel was The Red Spectacles, and the movie before that was The Red Tent. You may have been expecting The Red Shoes, great movie, but I've already seen it, and it's kind of already been picked clean in terms of reviews. It's been done. What can I say? Maybe you thought it would be The Red Violin. That movie is really bad, in my opinion, and I have no desire to watch it again or think about it. I briefly checked out the Red Sea Diving Resort. Looks absolutely terrible, so not a contender. Interestingly, Reds was actually inspired in part by a movie called Red Bells, which was a Soviet film directed by Sergei Bondarchuk. Bondarchuk wanted Warren Beatty to appear in it. Very similar subject matter, but Beatty decided to make his own. Pretty cool. I'd love to watch Red Bells and Red Bells 2. I've yet to track down a copy with English subtitles, but hopefully that will be coming on the channel in the future. Anyway, here we are with Reds. This movie is basically Warren Beatty's son. He co-wrote it, directed it, and stars in it as John Reed, also known as Jack Reed. Fingers crossed I don't call him Paul Reed. For some reason I find myself doing that. But Jack Reed, who was he? He was a journalist, essentially, who covered the Mexican Revolution, World War I, Bolshevik Revolution, about which he wrote the book 10 Days That Shook the World, a pretty well-known book. Jack Reed was a journalist, but he also tried his hand at activism, at politicking. He was a leftist, a socialist, communist, Marxist, in a word, red. Diane Keaton plays Louise Bryant, a feminist writer who also covered the Russian Revolution. This movie is largely a story of their relationship. This is a movie about the personal and also about the political and the historical and how those things intersect. This is a long movie. There's a lot of ideas there. It's a long movie, a sprawling movie. For the most part, they get the balance between the ideas pretty well. For the most part, they contain the sprawl. But there's a few things that they don't totally nail the balance, and I'll come back to that. Jack Nicholson is also in the movie. It's a shame he doesn't play Jack. I thought there were some union rules prohibiting another actor playing a character named Jack in a movie with Jack Nicholson in it, but I guess those rules hadn't been formally adopted yet. This movie is from 1981. In some ways, it's one of the last films of the 1970s, a last entry in American auteurism before Heaven's Gate, Jaws, and the 80s with its emerging corporate landscape that would doom serious American cinema, at least for a little while. In some ways, maybe Beatty already saw some of these things on the horizon as he was making this movie, this backwards-looking film. Jack Nicholson plays playwright and poet Eugene O'Neill, as in Long Day's Journey into Night. Incredible film adaptation of that with Katharine Hepburn, by the way. Early 60s. Sidney Lumet directed. What's Eugene O'Neill doing in this movie, though? Well, you're going to need to watch the movie to find out. One of the things that might already be clear is that this is not really a war movie. There are wars in the movie, but this isn't about battlefields, explosions, gunfire, or heroics. So here's the obligatory warning that this movie might not be that exciting to everyone. It's kind of long. It's mostly talking. That said, it's joltingly, interestingly, at least to me. Maybe you know the story, World War I, Bolshevik Revolution. Maybe you know the story from 30,000 feet, but what did it look like on the ground? How did people think about this stuff? How did they live their lives among all this upheaval and history? The personal, the historical, and the political. The production quality of this movie is immense. Great. Big budget, big sets, but not really the sort of epic sets you would see in Dr. Zhivago, War and Peace. This movie takes us a lot of different places. Portland, Oregon, New York, St. Petersburg, Finland, Azerbaijan, believe it or not. And we do see cool architecture. We see some fancy interiors, some big halls, and some big stuff. But the big set pieces aren't really the focus. Instead, it's one of these movies that's just convincing through and through. The cinematography is really solid. A lot of these different sort of pieces, like I said, sprawling movie, tons of locations, we get a few different visual styles from time to time. For the most part, I think they're cool. There's one or two that look a little bit cheesy, almost like sepia or something like that, almost trying to look really nostalgic or something. There's a few that don't come off, but for the most part, this movie is really well shot. It has a huge cast. I already mentioned a few, but it's also got author Jerzy Kosinski in it. He wrote the book Being There and later helped adapt it into the Peter Sellers film. It's got Paul Sorvino, Maureen Stapleton, Gene Hackman even has a small role in it. Overall, I think the acting is quite good. Diane Keaton and Warren Beatty are really warm, and I think you really buy into their lives. The one massive asterisk is that I think there's a lot of anachronism in the acting in Reds. Keaton and Beatty seem really intuitive and real, but they do not seem like they're living in 1915. At least they didn't to me. Warren Beatty plays his usual, somewhat mumbly, understated self, slipping into a mannerism that seems kind of inherently linked to the 70s. He's got the same sense of humor that you would find in the movie Shampoo, and to me it sticks out a little bit. I'm not saying that old movies have to seem old or that people should always put on ridiculous accents or something. I think it's a balancing act between the past seeming distant but also seeming relatable. These were people, after all, and most likely they were relatable in some ways. How can you make them real and vivid but also sort of show how different things were? I'm just talking about the acting here, but I think the anachronism extends to some extent to the writing and maybe to some of the bigger ideas of the film, too. I'm going to come back to that later on. Of course, there's some Hollywood-isms in this movie. If you read through some Wikipedia pages after watching the movie, you'll see that certain liberties were taken. Things were made maybe a little bit more dramatic. This doesn't stick out too much when you're just watching the movie, although there's maybe a few pieces that seem extreme. But the story is extreme, and some of those extreme pieces are accurate. Some of them aren't. Some of them were even crazier in real life, I think. Overall, not too bad in terms of the historical feel. Like I said, it doesn't stick out as you watch it. Let me say that overall, this movie has a very impressive screenplay. Lots of nice little moments, lots of clever stuff. For instance, we get a lot of repetition with Jack Reed always having a cab waiting for him, or always hitting his head on a chandelier, and then later remembering that chandelier being a special part of his life. At one point, Louise asks Jack to read an article she wrote for a newspaper or something. Jack says that it has too much repetition in it. She says, well, this is intentional. It's for artistic effect. So perhaps that right there is a bit of sly self-reference to Beatty's use of repetition. This is a nice script. What can I say? It's got a lot of these little clever moments. It's a very smart script, and in general, I think a very smart movie. Is it a wise movie? That's another question we'll come to, but it's certainly a smart one. This movie also just has a ton of moving parts. I think you have to respect the effort that went into telling this huge and complicating story. There's also one interesting technique that's really at the forefront, which is the use of interviews with real people, witnesses to the event, referred to just as witnesses in the film. These interviews are spliced in throughout the movie, just talking head interviews with old people, basically. It's possible that you'd still have basically the same movie if you got rid of all of these, but they add an interesting angle. At the very least, they add perspective to the narrative. We usually see 3 or 4 of these interview clips back to back, and usually the interviewees are all offering somewhat different opinions on things. Oh, Jack and Louise were a couple. Oh, no, they weren't. It was just sort of implied. People didn't know. All these interesting different perspectives. There's something really historical about these. These interviews aren't used for didactics as much as they're used to sort of destabilize the view that the film might otherwise lean towards. There's 1 or 2 times where they use one of these interviews to sort of lead into something. But for the most part, They kind of just offer a little bit more color, a little bit more perspective, which is cool, I think. Could you get rid of them and shorten the movie a bit? Probably. Reds has some powerful scenes. The hardest hitting moments are probably the most personal ones, not the Russian Revolution, but the relationship between Luis and Jack. This is a great romantic film, I gotta say. A great film about the drama of trying to share your life with somebody. If this movie had just been set in 1981 and was simply the story of Jack and Louise, their relationship, I think it would be a big hit. Now, I will say that for me, there might have been maybe just one or too many fallouts between them. And my investment in their relationship maybe slipped as we get farther into the movie. Maybe it seems at some point like these interpersonal conflicts aren't existential, like the stakes aren't super high, as much as it's just two people who are going to argue a lot, and that's just the way they live. Oh, it'll work out. They'll get back together. Maybe they don't quite get the balance right, and we get just a tiny bit too much back and forth, but it could just be me. Like I said, maybe some issues with the balance of the movie overall, but subtle ones. Overall, this personal part of the film is very strong. Like I said, you could set this part today, or in the present or whatever. But I think that Louise and Jack's relationship also has a particular salience taking place in the early days of the 20th century, before women had the right to vote. Louise is a feminist, and from the very beginning of the film, she's really interested in an independent life. She doesn't want to be a housewife. This is fairly common now, I guess, but 100 years ago, not so much. Freedom is a big theme of this movie all the way through. Whether or not that's freedom on a big political level, freedom in a Marxist sense, or freedom in the household, freedom to make one's own life, or if it's the freedom you might find in New York City. It turns out that freedom is complicated in all those angles. Louise and Jack are interested in a new form of relationship based on mutual respect, but this turns out to be a lot easier said than done. Personal and political, small things. Like bringing flowers. Jack brings Louise flowers a few times, and you think, is that pinning her down in some way? Interesting. Some of these questions are still being contested today. Interesting. Louise meets Jack in Portland, Oregon, and later joins him in New York. A lot of the movie is set in New York, in Greenwich Village, mainly. Here, Louise doesn't find Jack living a rigid academic lifestyle, as maybe you would expect some sort of semi-esteemed reporter to. Instead, she finds him among bohemians, dancing and debating until the early hours of the morning. I remember when I went to college, I expected people to be maybe more serious about academic life than they were. I went to a very academic school, famous for not having much to do. Obviously, this wouldn't be what you would expect some places, but that was sort of what I had been thinking I would find. But what I actually found was bohemians dancing and debating until the early hours of the morning. It almost felt as if they weren't being appropriately reverent of the situation. Here we are, full-time intellectuals. Not many times in your life you get to do that, making huge sacrifices to be here, and yet not taking it seriously in some ways, like making noise in a library, right? This isn't supposed to be fun. Of course, I had a lot of classmates who had a wealthy, elite background, for whom college wasn't necessarily as serious. Perhaps for them, they were just following in their parents' footsteps and having the college experience. Okay. I say all this because when Louise shows up in New York, she seems to have a somewhat similar experience. Showing up and seeing freedom, but also seeing hedonism there. And that's kind of interesting. Isn't this supposed to be serious? Isn't Jack Reed supposed to be obsessed with, the truth, with spreading the word, with changing the world? Why are all these people having fun or whatever, not being serious? Interesting, the personal and the political, seeing the real side of people, it's complicated, it turns out. It's also interesting that in a lot of ways she's hanging with a similar crowd to what I was, with some sort of elite background. Are these the activists of the world? Are these the movers and shakers? Does it delegitimize their work? These are all interesting questions, and it's a story for another time, what I ended up thinking about all this by the time I graduated, but interesting questions. Louise is also somewhat put off by living in Jack's shadow. She doesn't want to be seen simply as a companion to a person who is in the scene already. But at the same time, she feels uncomfortable with him trying to set her up for something, introduce her as something. Both angles understandable here. At first, maybe very lonely, very self-conscious times. I mention these dynamics not because I think they're like crucial pieces of the movie, really. Eventually, Louise does find a way into the community. She does find a home. I mention it instead because it emphasizes how subtle a lot of the interpersonal dynamics in the film are. If you like the same kind of mature psychological realism that I like, you should watch this movie because it has a lot of it. There's real nuance and subtlety in a lot of the feelings, a lot of the snafus that go back and forth. These are not like simple storylines of the house burning down or something like that. They're complicated dynamics here. Now, like I said, this movie does have some issues, and here's where we turn a little bit to the political side of things. After boredom, the main thing that people might dislike about this movie is that it has fairly extreme politics. There are some political criticisms of this film that I think are valid and very reasonable, and there's also some that are maybe a little bit silly. Let me say, first of all, that you don't have to be a socialist or a communist to like Reds. And if your objection to the film is that you don't like communism, you might have to file that objection in the silly category, to be honest. This is a movie about socialists and communists. I'm fudging these terms a little bit only because there's different characters in the movie who have different affiliations, and because even Jack himself changes affiliations a few times. But you get the idea. This is a movie about communists. That doesn't mean that it's a movie that shoves any particular ideology down anyone's throats. There's a lot of different ways to interpret it. Reed is one of the main characters, but that doesn't mean that everything he says should be taken at face value. You know, at one point he tells a big crowd of Russians that if they revolt, the United States will follow in their footsteps. Germany will follow in their footsteps. The world will follow in their footsteps. And wars will be over. The workers of the world will unite, and wars will be over. Which is exactly what happened. No, it's not what happened. This is sort of clear dramatic irony here, where we're shown pretty clearly that this is idealism, naivete, perhaps. The movie's not trying to sugarcoat that, I guess. Throughout the movie, Jack is criticized from a bunch of different sides. He's told that he should stick to writing, for instance, not get into politics. He's told that he's not truly committed to politics because he's too focused on his relationships. He's not willing to sacrifice everything for the cause. He's told that he's just doing it for the limelight. He's told that he has no right to tell the working class what they want because he isn't truly one of them. A lot of interesting criticisms, a lot of those that actually stick. He knows that some of them stick, too, and you can see it in the movie. Obviously, there's a lot of communism in the movie, but if you reach the end of the film and you think it's a simplistic view of history, you're probably projecting. This is a complicated movie with a lot of uncertainty in it, a lot of politics, a lot of ideals, and also a lot of outcomes that aren't exactly what people were hoping for. Louise Bryant has kind of similar questions facing her. She doesn't have the unwavering moral high ground that you might expect to find. In a lot of movies, her character would have sort of a fairy tale arc. A forward-thinking girl who moves to the big city faces some initial trials, but thanks to her talents and her belief, she makes it, thanks to her moral purity as well, her progressivism, her forward-thinking nature. I don't think you can really describe Bryant's character like this. Reed criticizes her writing for being repetitive, like I said. You might think that she's going to be an excellent writer, who proves him wrong. But later on, she reads the article and realizes that actually he was right. Of course, she grows from this and she is successful, but not through some inevitable talent or moral purity. Instead, it's more a piece of getting older, taking certain opportunities, having things go her way. So, like I said, the movie's not exactly putting these characters on a pedestal, and it's probably a mistake to take the things they say throughout the film entirely at face value. Like I said, it's a complicated movie, and it's a big disservice to reduce it down to one political viewpoint. That said, there is something that irritated me about this movie, which is that sometimes I did think it was a bit too on the nose. At the end of the day, this is a complex movie, like I said, but it does have a lot of idealism in it, and maybe idealism will annoy you. In the early parts of the movie in particular, some of this idealism made me cringe a little bit. Hearing some of this just unflinching idealism reminded me again of my undergrad days, I guess, where it was somewhat fashionable to endorse similar ideas without really knowing much about them. Now, I've got nothing against communism, quite the opposite actually, but I think it's good to know stuff, and plenty of communists and Marxists do, but there's something about the idealism here and the idealism of a freshman that seem a little bit similar in some ways, and it got on my nerve watching the movie. It almost seemed, I don't know, a bit too predictable or something like that. Of course, this movie isn't about kids trying on communist rhetoric in school. It's about real card-carrying, literally card-carrying communists. So maybe it doesn't make much sense to say that they sound too much like communists, to say that it's too predictable. These are big ideas, and it's like, yeah, they sound like communists. They are communists. That's the point, right? Okay, fair enough. But there's, I don't know, another angle to it where it also just seems slightly anachronistic at times, I guess, especially in the beginning of the movie, where maybe it seems like we're hearing actually the voice of the 70s more than anything else. Like the movie is catering to the audience of the day, and really I've got no interest in that. I realize this is kind of a vague criticism. I don't know, maybe an unfair one, but like I said, by the time we get to the end of the movie, it's clear that things are complicated. But on the way through there, we pass through a few monologues, which are just a bit too on the nose. Maybe the point is that it's supposed to be naive, it's supposed to seem idealistic, and the tables will turn, right? Maybe that makes sense, but look, it just annoyed me to watch it, okay? It's also worth noting, I guess, that some people actually don't think this movie is leftist enough. And I think for other people, they probably take this as a lot of great evidence to why communism is silly. This movie was actually screened in the Reagan White House. So, like I said, politics might be a stumbling block to some people because it is an extreme part of the film. But I think there is a lot of subtlety there. Did they get it exactly spot on? I don't know. Overall, though, I don't want to say that this is just some objective historical film, right? It has a lot of different perspectives in it, and it removes itself to some extent from its characters, right? It undermines its characters from time to time, shows them making mistakes, being silly, being uncertain, changing their minds, right? And so it does have a historical lens to some extent, but like I said, it also has a political lens. This is definitely a political film. It doesn't claim to have all the answers, but it does take a stance on some things. I would say the film is an anti-war film. It's a film that looks at economic exploitation. It's a film that looks at women's rights. And it's a movie that pokes at traditional American values. It's a movie that provokes. I don't think it's over-the-top didactic, but it is political without a doubt. This is a movie, like I said, that balances the historical, the political, and the personal. And it has more objective historical facets, but it also has provocative political facets. Interestingly, one of the questions that Jack Reed faces throughout the film is how he should balance his writing with his activism. Writing being his more objective, non-editorial, journalistic pursuit. He believes in that very strongly, which is kind of interesting. You see him being very politically active, but you also see him very strongly believing in being non-editorial in his reporting. His activism is the opposite. How does he balance these? This is a question that the movie explores in a lot of different ways. It's also a question that you can imagine would resonate with Warren Beatty, an actor and an activist. Speaking of idealism, Beatty was heavily involved with George McGovern's presidential campaign. But in 1981, maybe some of the optimism was starting to fade. I mentioned that this movie is framed in interviews. One of the effects is that Reds really has a backwards-looking feel, reminiscing about a time and a place, about legendary people from the day, half forgotten but still glimmering in the back of people's minds. A time and a place where ideas really mattered. People who thought they were going to change the world, and who did. Maybe not exactly in the way they had planned, though. To me, I think the most powerful thing about this movie is not the history, or the politics, or the personal drama. It's not the sets, it's not the scale, it's not the acting. All those things are pretty great. This is a great movie. But to me, the biggest thing is that it's an extremely compelling story of people who devoted their lives to ideas, who turned their back on any conventional definition of prospects or security or stability and focused on something they thought was bigger. For all the ups and downs that Jack and Louise faced, they had incredible lives. And this is a vivid portrait of incredible lives among history, among ideas, not in the mainstream. And to me, that is the most compelling thing about this movie. And it's extremely compelling, haunting, even. Okay. See you guys next week.